Hello and welcome to the Melodology podcast. This is the very first episode of this new podcast, and I'm really excited to bring this to you. And my first composer guest today is Christina Rusnak, who I just met at the Ultimate Music Business Summit a couple weeks ago. Welcome, Christina. It's wonderful to have you here as my premier star.
Thank you for having me.
This is a podcast about melodies. We're going to be examining a number of different melodies in the podcast, but the official tagline of the podcast right now is celebrating the unsung excellence of melody makers. So the idea is we're looking at these melodies and we're going to be looking at different parts of them and the way they're constructed, and we're going to be talking about them as people who create melodies ourselves. And we're going to be celebrating how excellent the talents and the skills of the people who created these melodies are. I think of a melody, myself, Christina, I think of a melody as kind of like a key to a lock. It's got a certain shape and it fits a certain way. Sometimes I think of it like a flavor, like it's cinnamon, the flavor of cinnamon. You know what that tastes like. And as soon as you taste it, you know it's cinnamon. And as soon as you hear a particular melody, you recognize that melody. And it has an emotional context, and so does a flavor. And I think of that, when I'm thinking in terms of the way these notes are arranged to create this really identifiable sound that is a melody. So that's what the podcast is about. Welcome to the first episode. I'm really excited to get this started and get this going. And we will have a guest star, our guest composer on every single episode. This time, our guest composer is, again, Christina Rusnak. Tell us about yourself and your background.
Hi, I've been composing since I was 9 years old, but like a lot of composers, I took a detour after high school and college and actually got a business degree. And then after a few years, I continued to compose, and I suddenly realized that I needed to get it out of my living room and, become more professional and learn. So in my 30s, I started music school for the first time and finished graduate school in 2010.
What is like the first melody that you can remember hearing, or the first piece of music that you really remember?
That's a tough question because music, my mother was a musician, and not professionally, but at the amateur level. And so music was in my house all the time. I did not realize it as a child, but I inherited her record collection and her music collection after she died. And she was like an aficionado of the latest and greatest new music of the time in the 50s and, but classical music and jazz. So I grew up with that. I would say Mendelssohn. My mother loved to play Mendelssohn and Rachmaninoff. So I would say one of those was probably the first thing that, but I don't really remember. It was all sorts of music was in my house all the time.
Is there a particular song or melody or piece of music that you can think back to and remember that really made you think about how powerful music or melody can be?
The Mendelssohn's Book of Songs Without Words is one of my favorites. And while I'm not a pianist, I was able to play several of those. And the favorite is Agitation. It's number 68. And it's got this very romantic, arpeggiated sound to it. But the melody is over the top, fingered with the right hand pinky, where it's very, very compelling. And it's still one of my very favorite melodies and very favorite pieces.
Are you a fan of film scores?
Yes, I love film scores. If I were to pick a favorite score, it's so hard because there is so much great film music out there. Mm-hmm. It's really hard. I would say in the older films, North by Northwest, Bernard Herrmann. Yeah, that is so compelling, and I have these. It's like the latest flavor, I discover somebody new. I love Anne Klein, Alexander Desplat, mm-hmm. And then. Currently, I'm watching Discovery of Witches. I mean, Rob Lane's score is absolutely fabulous. There's just so many out there that are wonderful.
I will have to take a look at that. Today, we're going to be talking about a particular melody. When starting to plan out this podcast, I was thinking about sort of classic popular tunes. And I was thinking about, old songs that everybody really knows and classics and so forth. And I of course, I put it out there that the guest composers can suggest a melody that they would like to talk about. And if they don't have anything in particular, then I've got this list that I can't wait to get to. Mm-hmm. And you picked a melody that I definitely think is now a classic tune, but it's less than 10 years old. And every single young girl, at least in the United States, was singing this song at the top of their lungs constantly. And I'm sure parents both loved and hated this song because it's a fantastic melody. It's beautiful. And the song we're talking about today is Let It Go from the Disney movie Frozen. When you suggested it, my first thought...
Excuse me. Editor Arthur here. I realized in my excitement to get episode 1 recorded that we had left out the names of the people who wrote this song. And this is, after all, a podcast celebrating the unsung excellence of melody makers. So leaving out the names, just not acceptable. This song was composed by Kristen Anderson Lopez and her husband, Robert Lopez. Now, back to our podcast.
When you suggested it, my first thought was, I was listening to that song every time I turned on the radio when the movie came out. It seemed like it was the only thing that was playing for weeks and weeks and weeks. So I kind of discounted it. Yes, it was catchy and so forth, but I didn't at the time necessarily think that it was going to be a long-term classic song or whatever. It just seemed like it was, the current fad at the time. But you bringing it up and you suggesting it, of course, I want to look at the melody and see what it looks like. And it turns out this is a fantastically written melody. Now, today we're just going to be talking about the refrain of this song, the part where it is the words "Let It Go." And maybe in the future we'll come back and talk about the other parts because the song is very well composed. So tell me about your impression about Let It Go before we get into the notes.
I interpreted it as really kind of girl power, that young women can make their choices. They can be confident in themselves, and they don't have to worry about what others say. They can be their own human beings, and that's how I interpreted the context of the song. And I'm not sure all the little girls interpreted it that way on a conscious level, but surely on a subconscious level, perhaps at least mine did, my little girls. And so it's iconic in that way. I agree that, when new operas or whatever come out, you may not think, oh, well, this is going to be the song, but this has become the song for a generation of little girls.
We had a conversation before the podcast about it, and you talked about how the refrain is very much like an aria, and the verses of the song are more like a recitative in terms of opera music. Could you explain that a little bit more?
Well, the beginning of the song starts in E minor, and it's almost like a recitative in that you have all these repeated notes. It's very spoken. It's very declarative. And then you have this bridge, this transition that moves toward the refrain. And then again, it transforms into G major, the relative major from E minor. And then it becomes this aria in the piece. It's very, the idea of her speaking and her declaring it is very much present, which you don't get in pop songs, very much, or you don't get in a lot of songs. And that, I think that's one of the reasons it's so compelling, is it's speaking to us, regardless of, whether you're a little girl or the character is vulnerable and she's having difficulties. Just because she's a queen doesn't mean she doesn't have problems, right?
Right.
And so she's very vulnerable and she has these issues and she's trying to be who she is. And she's really struggling with that. And I think all of us can relate to that. We want to be who we are, even as composers. I'm a very lyrical composer, and I want to write orchestra music. It's all about the gesture. We're not supposed to have melodies in orchestra music, but mine have melodies, and that's okay. And so I think we all struggle with it, regardless of where we are in life, where we are in music. And I think that's one of the things that makes it so compelling. It'd be fascinating to see if other listeners interpret the song the same way, as like a recitative and an aria. I don't know.
And just to clarify for folks who aren't as familiar with opera, the recitative in an opera, that kind of a piece of music, is used to tell a lot of information. It's a way of not necessarily showing off vocal talent, but musically telling the story part of what needs to be told. It gives you the backstory, or it gives you the setting for then. The aria is a piece of music that really, it lets the soloist show off their talent, and it also is supposed to be really beautiful, beautiful music. Uh-huh. And so that's the difference between a recitative and an aria. And this song very much does that, where she starts out singing, she's singing about the situation and the backstory. And then when she gets to the melody that we're about to discuss, it's a declaration of what she has decided to do. And, it's a pivotal moment for her as a character. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. Or actually, let's take a listen to that. This is a podcast after all. But for those of you who would like to look at what the notes look like, we're going to be sharing video on the Melodology podcast Patreon page. So everything, by the way, social media for this is Melody Podcast. So it's patreon.com/Melody Podcast. And if you'd like to see what it is that we're looking at as we're discussing this, the video of this podcast is available at that Patreon page. So I'm going to go ahead and just start playing the melody at the very beginning. And we're just going to play a little bit of it to start so we can talk about it piece by piece. And we're basically exploring the melody as if we're walking along a path and we've never seen anything on this path before. And as we see each item, we're going to be discussing it and saying, look at the rhythm or the notes or the outline of the sounds here. And so I'm going to start with just a little bit of the opening of this melody. So let's just start with that. What are you noticing about the melody right here at the beginning of the refrain of Let It Go?
Well, there's a couple of things. One, you have these three notes, let it go, let it go. Even though the pitch is rising in the first one and it's a leap in the second one, it's still a three-note rhythmic, eighth notes. But it doesn't land. I mean, people are listening to this, and it says, let it go, but it's not, the go does not fall on the downbeat. It falls on the second half of the fourth beat. And so you have this continuation. So it's not let it go, it's let it go, let it go. I find that really, really compelling because that continues the dialogue aspect of the melody.
And this is an aspect more often seen, really, in my experience, more often seen in pop music. In terms of vocal music, it's more often seen in pop music than in classical music. In classical music or more art music, very often the words are spoken or the notes hit on downbeats more often. And in more modern music and in jazz and things like that, it's more spoken. So you wouldn't necessarily say, let it go. Let it go. You would say, let it go, let it go. And it's what she's doing here. I also think it's an interesting thing about the melody that it's going up a little bit here. We've changed to the key of G, and the word go, the very first time where she hits go, that is the tonic note. That is the main note of the key of G. So she's landing on note number 1 right here. And then in the second part, she goes to note number 2. She goes up a step. So again, it's like this. And at that point, we have a repeat of those 3 notes going up to the tonic. So just like the very beginning where she sings Let It Go, where it says anymore in the first refrain, it's the same 3 notes going up.
If I could add a little bit to that, I know we're really not talking that much about the harmony, but the let it, the very first let it, the first 2 notes, your measure is in the key of C. And so the perfect fifth is often considered a heroic, interval. And so while it says let it go, you're putting yourself in G, and that's 1 of G. It's also 5 of C. So when you have the second one, let it go, you're still in G, and that's pitch 2, but then the chord, the harmonic structure in the next measure shifts to D, and that's the 5 of D. So I think you have very little heroic statements here in the underlying chord structure.
Yes, very much. Let's continue walking along the path of this melody and see what we notice as we're moving forward. So let's stop there. What have you noticed about it again?
Well, you have this, it's kind of goes back to that E minor really briefly. So you have it still in G, but it says, let's back up into the E minor a little bit, because it says it's having that same 3-note motive, but it leaps up. So where the second time in the first statement, let it go, it's going up a 5th. Now you're going up a 6th, let it go. It goes up to the E, which is either 3rd of G or the 5 of E minor. So it's really stretching it, and that's what we continue to see. It's E, F, G, which is this 3rd interval, and then it goes to a 5th interval, and now it's going to repeats the 3rd interval, and now it's going to a 6th interval.
Yeah, I want to point out a lot of times melodies, and this is sort of music theory 101 stuff. Melodies follow a scale up or down. Mm-hmm. So when when the notes are going upward, it tends to be uplifting and happy or exciting sounding. And when the notes are going downward, it tends to be more relaxing or sad, or in some cases it's the end of a line and the notes go back down, but it's a resolution, and it's calming to have the notes go back down once they've gone away from the home note, to have them go back down to the home note. So we've gone from the first note of the scale, which is the G. We've gone up to the the A, 1 note up from there. And then the 4th time she says, let it go, we've gone up to B, which is the 3rd note of the scale. And then just a little bit later, she pushes up. Again, we've got that 3 notes on turn away, that turn away. She sings turn away and slam the door there. But when she says slam, she's reached the 4th note of the scale. Mm-hmm. So turn away, those 3 notes are that same rhythm where it's not landing on the downbeat, it's preceding the downbeat by a half of a beat. But then she's gone all the way up to the 4th of the scale, and the 4th of the scale, functionally, that note likes to go back down to the 3rd, and that's what it does. So just playing that one little spot again. It actually hits the 4th, but it slides back down a little bit, which, it's as if she's pushing higher and higher and more energy as the melody is moving along in this spot. Anything else you'd like to point out before we move on a little farther?
No, I think you've covered it.
All right, so I'm going to play that part and then let it just move on into the next part of the melody. Here is the spot where the melody all of a sudden is landing on the downbeat, which you were talking about this being a declarative statement on her part, but this is the moment where the song becomes a declaration.
Yes, absolutely. That's a really strong note in G. I mean, that's the 5 down to the 3 down to the 2, and it's really important notes. You're not resolving it while you're going down from 5 to 3. If you were going down to G, that would be a resolution, but you're not. By going down to the 2, you're keeping it open.
And in that part, again, you've got basically D to A, which is a fourth down, but it's the same as a fifth up. But at the same time, we've reached the peak of the piece. The second time that D comes in, let me just play it again real quick so you can hear. So that section right there, it repeats the D, but then she actually, that part right there, that is the whole home chord of G major.
Yes.
Not only is it, the melody is now landing on the downbeat, very declarative, but at this point, she has musically said she's home. And in later lyrics, the words are, "Here I am in the light of day." She's basically declaring where she is, and she's saying, this is, my decision to be here. And this is what's happening. And it's very musically saying what her words are saying as well, which is brilliant.
She's saying she's home. This is where she is, and this is who she is. And I think that's part of it.
Yep. And so I'm going to go ahead and continue just from that to that highest point of the melody, and I'm going to continue out to the end of the refrain. So that's the end of the refrain. And I notice in there that it repeats the rhythm of the refrain when it's, the words here are "let the storm rage on." And when she sings "storm rage on," it's the same rhythm as the previous points where the melody got to its most powerful and where she was most, declarative in that. So I'm noticing that repeat of that particular rhythm again. And then it almost goes back into the same sort of recitative rhythms as in the other parts of the song. And the melody here drops out of that high declarative range and, resolves down all the way down to the low G, which is, again, that's the main note of the whole key that we're in, but it's an entire octave down from where it was, which to me feels, it's like, I've made the decision, and that breath that you take and you let out after you've made the decision, or after you've hit something powerful, you can just, you can go ahead and rest in that space.
At the beginning, you have the three notes ascending. Here, you have three notes descending, and a fourth instead of a third. And I think it really is a balance to the beginning of the refrain. It's coming down in the same way, but with a fourth instead of a third. I think it's a very, very strong message. And again, to your point, the next lyric does go back to that recitative, and this cold never bothered me anyway. Again, you're back into that recitative, and the low G there, it sets you up for the next verse.
The melody has reached a peak, and then again, she's, to me, it's a declaration that it's, that's the powerful moment. And then it leans, it kind of calms itself back down, and the music represents that same thing. It's coming down from the most intense moment and moving itself to a point of resolution and a point of feeling calm again. Is there anything else you'd like to point out about the melody that you've noticed along the way as we were looking at it?
We covered it pretty well.
Awesome. Again, the melody, to me, I didn't think about the melody as being something that was really fantastic when I heard it on the radio. It was catchy. I thought it was catchy, but I didn't think about the composition that went into it. And it actually is a really brilliantly constructed melody. Now let's talk about what's going on with you. You're a composer. You're uniquely a composer who works on cultural issues and geographic issues. And I thought that was very interesting thing to find out about you, because every composer I know has a very unique perspective, a unique thing going on with them, what makes their music and their experience individual. So tell us about some of the things that you would like to share musically with the audience.
Well, let me give you just like a 1-minute background. I got my first in graduate school. I had some art history background, and I discovered the discipline of cultural geography, and that really was a pivotal point for me in really. I love landscape, I love nature, but really being able to focus it, really being able to say, what is the higher level meaning of this landscape? What is going on here? And my first commission was for the Dallas Contemporary Art Museum, which is mid-century music, and really taking that and saying, what is special about this building, about this place? And the result was 161 Glass, which is the address of the museum, but it's also 3-movement work talking about its history as a metal fabricating plant and its new role as a experimental creation art space. Okay, so that's where it started. And then I had a residency at Homestead National Monument, and the actual Homestead Act was there, and learning about the history, and that's where this all started. This is where it all started. How could I write about this place, about the homestead, when that act was very controversial, very a big issue, and how could I not make it a larger, more inclusive work? And that's where that started. And so I started working on projects. I guess you gravitate as composers. We gravitate towards certain things. I'm not saying I'm in a box where I only do these things, and that's, because I certainly don't. But I do gravitate toward them. For instance, in 2016, I had a residency at North Cascades National Park. And it's one of the hardest places to get to. Stehekin, the little homesteading town, is you only can get there by hiking 25 miles across a glacial pass, by boat or by float plane. There's no roads. You can't get there. So I took the boat up, and there's only about 60 year-round residents. And the Lake Chelan is a glacial. It would be like a fjord if it went out to the ocean, but it doesn't. It's enclosed, but its mountains so close to the waters it's like fjord-like. There you rise 8,000-9,000 feet up, and you're practically right next to the water, and it's simply amazing landscape. And so I ended up writing a piece called The Way Through. I worked with the school children. I was there almost 3 weeks, and I worked with people who live there all year round. And I tried to get a sense of what was special about this place. And the kids sang folk songs in the way that our parents' generation sang folk songs, right? They knew all these old songs, and one of the pieces was Will the Circle Be Unbroken? So what I did is I wove my motive of the majesty, my melody of this high-reaching majesty of mountains with the folk song and how they come together in this place. So that's what I did. If we want to listen to like the first 20, 25 seconds or so. And it is a rather angular melody. It's not as step by step as Let It Go. But you hear it rise up and then it comes back down. And this is the initial melody for the piece. And if you go to the next part, this is the folk song. And this is not the same harmony that's in the folk song. This is taking it these mountains are dangerous. It's there's the snow that they encounter each year is tremendous, and it's a hard life. And I wanted to reflect that there's community, but this is not an easy life. So at the very end, I bring them together. I like to do this kind of juxtapose the different melodies in different ways. And I did this with the Homestead piece as well. My most recent orchestral piece is called The South Pass. It's a chamber orchestra piece. And both of these, I have to admit, are MIDI. We had a recording of the way through, but it was windy and it was papers were flying, and the recording didn't go well. It was an outdoors Instaheeken.
All right, so now we're going to be listening to the South Pass. Tell us about what we're about to listen to.
The South Pass is an expansion of the Oregon Trail Suite that I wrote in 2018 for the National Trails and Wild and Scenic River Act. It was performed, the various movements were performed all over the country in several cities. But the South Pass, this middle movement didn't feel finished to me. It felt incomplete. It felt like I didn't really tell the story of this place. And the South Pass, scholars argue that without the South Pass, we would have had Spain controlling California and the Southwest, and British controlling the Northwest, that we would never have an America as we know it today. It was that critical. But yet, for thousands and thousands of years, this has been a major trade route, an animal migration route. It was near one of the top 5 trading routes in the entire country pre-Columbian times. So it was very important. So I have a 3-note motive, and it goes in 3 directions. This is kind of the setup. It's the air, the atmosphere, and so it's a 4th down and a 2nd. I use a 4th and a 2nd, so a total of a 5th. And then the next melody, next cue, is the main melody of the entire piece. It's really this intervallic melody, and it goes up and it comes back down, and it repeats over and over as part of this arduous journey. And the last cue is I take that same motive and then I invert it at the end.
So by inverting, for people who aren't familiar with music composition, you've taken the notes and you've turned them upside down.
Right. Not exactly, but it's very close to upside down, yes. So you have it coming down. So you have it toward what you were talking about, Arthur, is that calming. We're going down the other side of the continental divide. We're going to the trading place. The settlers are going toward Oregon. They've made it past the big hurdle. And so it's very calming, a relief that they've finished this arduous climb. But at the same time, you could hear where I've taken the main melody and intersected it with it. And then at the very end, and we don't have to play this, it takes all three of the melodies and they bring them together and they overlay each other, because the whole journey has been about all of those factors, the landscape, the journey up, and the calming climb down.
So you have one more cue to share with us, and this one is a departure from the other pieces of music that you've shared. Tell us about this one.
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, it predates them. I went to the University of North Texas for graduate school, and I love jazz. I grew up with jazz, and I worked with one of the arrangers at the UNT, and we put it together, and we kind of said, well, how am I going to do this? Because I don't have those skills at the time. It was like 2006, 2008, and I was just starting graduate school. And he says, "No, I got this. Let me arrange it for you." And it ended up being a great arrangement. And so this is really about this is going to date us, chat rooms. Remember, way back in the 2000s, there were chat rooms. And this is about all the activity that goes on. And my jazz pieces are my most melodious pieces. They have the richest melodies, I think, not because my orchestral pieces don't, it's just that the jazz genre lends itself to very straightforward melodies. So.
All right, so here is a cue from Chat.
So one of the things I did in working with the arranger is I play this piece all the time. This is one of my very favorite pieces that I continue to play all the time. And I played it for him, even though I gave him a 4-part score to get started with the arrangement. I actually played for it, we recorded it, and so he could get the sense of the energy and where it flows. I'm a soprano, I'm a mezzo-soprano, so I just sang the melody. So I am actually this year working on I have 3 jazz pieces on my first jazz album, and I'm working on 3 more for a future jazz album.
Oh, that's fantastic. It's a great breadth of style that you have. Anything else you'd like to say in closing about things that are coming up for you, or anything else?
Yeah. I just finished a piece for American Wild Ensemble, and it's probably one of the most tonal pieces I've created. And it has great melody, again, using that perfect fifth and then down a second. So it has and that's its main motive. And then and then it goes in different iterations. And so it's about, for those people who live in Oregon and in the Portland region specifically, it's about Forest Park, the largest urban forest in the United States and one of the top urban forests in the world. And so it's about the origination of how Forest Park as a park came to be. So,
well, excellent.
That's it.
thank you very much for being here today. Thank you for being the first guest composer on the Melodology podcast. Tell us where people can find you on social media and online.
Oh, so I have an issue page if you wanted to look at all my scores. You just type in issue and then my name and it'll pop up. I have about, not all of them, but probably, 3/4 of all my scores are up there, adding more all the time. And I also have a SoundCloud page. It's mostly recorded works. I have a few MIDI works on there, but not many, mostly pieces that have been recorded. Of course, my website, ChristinaRusnak.com.
Excellent. And this is the Melodology podcast. I'm Arthur Breur. It's spelled Breur. It's 5 letters, and the last 3 letters look like Europe. And I'm Arthur Breur on almost all of the social media. The Melodology podcast is Melody Podcast on almost all of the social media. So Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, it's just Melody Podcast, and SoundCloud. But the website is melodologypodcast.com. And thank you very much, Christina, for making this first episode of the podcast exciting and fun. And thank you for choosing a really interesting melody. Please come back and listen to future episodes of the Melodology podcast. We have so many really cool pieces of music to explore and to examine, and we will continue celebrating the unsung excellence of melody makers.